Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a ranking of my top 7 favorite fantasy standalone novels. Now, I've read more than 7 standalone fantasy novels. I've read about 20 so far. And when I was thinking about how I would do this ranking, I wanted to do a ranking that would specifically be focused on what I thought were the best of the best. These are the cream of the crop. There's some great standalones that I did not include in this list, and there's some great standalones and some not so great standalones that I didn't include in this list, but this is the best of the best, the cream of the crop here. So you may disagree with me on what constitutes a standalone, but I think overall you'll all agree with that these are standalones, and these I think most people will agree that most of these are great, although I doubt people have my number one. And if you know me, you'll know what my number one is instantly. So I'm going to start with my number 7, which is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is a new release. This was Secret Project 1 for him. This was the big Princess Bride inspired book with the spores. He did a great video explaining the science behind how he did this book. The storytelling in this book is great. It's a humorous book. It's a fun book. It's a short book. It is Brandon Sanderson just letting loose and having fun with his story. And it's kind of Princess Bride in that, the male character is kidnapped by the Dread Pirate Roberts, so the female character has to go out after him and try to save him. And the characters are delightful, particularly the main characters, and some of the side characters on the ship that she's on are delightful. There's stuff with a dragon. It's just a delightful series, and I had a blast reading this thing. So that's why it's my number 7. My number 6 is the book Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's part of his Lord of the Rings universe. It was edited by Christopher Tolkien. It was finished after J.R.R. Tolkien died. This is a very unique book on the list because it's basically a bunch of parts of the story strung together and then in the middle you have Christopher Tolkien explaining this is how I compiled them, and these are the notes that Dad left, and all that stuff. And this is the hardest read on the list. It's very academic. It's very the prose is very elevated, but it's a sweet story. The story of Beren and Luthien is so sweet in this book. I loved it, and it's not quite fun, but the way that this book basically has 5 endings, where he basically says there's all these options. J.R.R. Tolkien never finished them, but he has all these options. He didn't know how the story ended, because the story is supposed to be an allegory kind of for him and his wife. On their tombstones, J.R.R. Tolkien and his wife have the words Beren and Luthien on them. So he didn't know how their story ended, so that's why he wasn't able to finish this. But it's a sweet story, some great ideas in the book, and I really loved it. So that's why it's my number 6. My number 5, I can't believe this made the list. This is A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. It's not exactly a novel. It's 3 novellas smushed together into one. But I enjoyed the heck out of this book. This is set in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire universe. The first book's the Game of Thrones, and they based the TV show off of that name, the Game of Thrones. And this is a prequel that's like set about 100 years before the show. And the problem with those books and the show was they're so heavy on language and sex and violence and stuff. And really, this book is meant for more family audiences. So all that is toned down significantly. And this, I wouldn't say this is all ages, but I think that teens and maybe even middle schoolers could handle this. I think that this, again, it's a bit more elevated prose than George R. R. Martin normally writes, but it's actually, the storytelling is great, the reveals in this book. It's about the stories of Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire, Egg. And you learn about who Egg is and why he's important to the Game of Thrones universe, the Song of Ice and Fire universe. This is such a great book, and it's one of my favorite Song of Ice and Fire books because it's actually appropriate. So that's my number 5. My number 4 is a Shannara novel called The First King of Shannara. This is technically a prequel to the Sword of Shannara novel, but it works as its own original standalone. I've read this a couple of times. I read it first a couple of years ago, several years ago, as when I was reading through the series, and then I also read it again when my friend and I were doing a podcast at the time. You can't find the podcast now; it's been disabled, unfortunately. But we did this podcast going through the Shannara novels, and this novel is one of my favorites in the Shannara universe, and it is largely standalone. There are connections to the heritage of Shannara series, some references to that, and of course there's connections to the Sword of Shannara, but it's a great novel in and of itself. Basically, this one character realizes the great enemy that we've been fearing is coming back, and no one believes him. So he basically gets a band of different druids from the Druids' Keep, and they all leave to go basically on their own quest to stop the bad guy. And meanwhile, the Druids' Keep is destroyed, and all the other druids destroyed. The druids in this book are like the Jedi in Star Wars, basically, because they didn't see the threat coming. And so now it's just a few druids left, and they have to band together and get armies and all this stuff to fight against the evil one, the Warlock Lord, Brona. And it's great. So that's why this is my number 4. My number 3 is the most recent read on the list, and that is the book Eyes of Silver by Michael Stackpole. I've been talking about it a lot recently. Now, do not judge the book by its cover. Do not, because this looks like such a cheesy, silly cover. But it is actually a great fantasy novel. It's very much military fantasy, and it's very much strategy-based, but there's a great segment of religious discussion that's really rooted in Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And there's great allegories for different countries of the world and how they fought, and they really work well in this fantasy world. The world building is really creative, and the characters are really strong. And this book, it was a delightful experience to read, and that's why it's my number 3. Again, do not judge this book by its cover. My number 2 book. Once I say number 2, people who know me will instantly know what my number 1 is. My number 2 is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This is my second favorite Brandon Sanderson novel and my second favorite standalone novel. Everything about this book works for me, like everything about it, and it's grown on me over time. The first time I read it, I really enjoyed it. The second time I read it, I loved it. And the third time I read it, I just could not believe what I was reading, how brilliant this story is. This is the story of Ciri, one of the princesses of a land, and she gets basically shipped off to become, to marry the king of another land. And she takes her sister's place, who was Vivenna. And so Vivenna is very angry about this. She had been trained to go marry this king, and she isn't sent because her father loves her more than the other sister. It's sad. And so Vivenna goes to try to rescue her sister, and then Vivenna gets caught in a rebellion against the king, basically. And Ciri is trying to navigate this new culture that she's unprepared for, and all of a sudden she's thrown at the feet of the king. And there's all great world building in this book. There's great character work. Ciri and the king, there's some great stuff with them. Vivenna and some of the characters around her, they are fantastic. There's some villains in this book and some surprises that are great. The magic system of the colors is one of my favorite magic systems. And it has just great romance in it. It has great action at the end of the book. It's a slower book, but it's got like great political themes, some great religious themes. Everything about this book worked for me, and that's why I love it so much. So that's why this is my number 2 favorite standalone fantasy novel. But as many of you will probably guess, there is one other book by Brandon Sanderson I love more, and I'm one of the few people who believes this. But my favorite standalone novel is Elantris. This is my favorite novel of all time. I think this is one of the most creative, one of the most inventive, one of the most important novels of all time. I think this book, in the next 50 years, people won't think as highly of this book, and usually it's rated at the bottom of Brandon's books. But I think when people think about the religious themes, the political themes, the plot lines of the difficulties of the characters, the character development, when they think about the romance in this book, when they think about the questions asked, when they think about the greater implications for how to apply things from this book into real life, I think that this book will grow on people and will become a classic because it is so darn good. And this is a book I just spent so much time thinking about it afterwards. And fantasy books, usually I'm like, all right, I'm done. Let's go on to the next one. I spent so much time thinking about this, and I've reread it a couple of times, and I just have a blast every single time I do. So that's why this is my favorite fantasy standalone novel of all time. So, if you've read some fantasy standalone novels, I'm sure you have a different list. Let me know. Please let me know in the comments section. Do you agree with my list? Do you like some of mine? Do you dislike some of my books? Let me know in the comments section. And please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel where you'll see lots of fantasy and other types of book discussions. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.